They said Sarah Chun died in that crash 5 years ago. Her body never recovered from the wreckage scattered across the Pacific. But when Flight 847 made an emergency landing with a pilot who shouldn't exist, displaying ink that matched the tattoo on a dead woman's shoulder, 3 investigators learned that some mysteries don't stay buried in the deep blue sea. Want to know how a ghost learned to fly again and why the aviation world will never be the same? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The control tower at Denver International Airport had seen its share of emergencies over the years, but nothing quite like the voice that crackled through the radio at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October. Air traffic controller Janet Morrison was halfway through her 3rd cup of coffee when the transmission broke through the static, clear as mountain air but carrying something that made the hair on her arms stand up. Denver Tower, this is unidentified. Aircraft requesting immediate emergency landing clearance. Engine failure, fuel critical, souls on board unknown. Morrison leaned forward, her fingers already moving across the radar display. The screen showed nothing but empty airspace where the voice claimed to be. Just the usual late-night cargo flights and red-eye passengers making their way across the continent. She double-checked the coordinates, ran a secondary sweep, even called over her supervisor Kevin Walsh, who squinted at the green glow with the same confusion she felt. Unknown aircraft, Denver Tower. We're not showing you on radar. Please confirm your position and aircraft type. The response came through with that same crystalline clarity, but underneath the professionalism, Morrison could hear something else. Exhaustion maybe, or something deeper. Something that sounded like someone who'd been flying for much longer than any fuel tank should allow. Denver Tower, I'm showing approximately 12 miles southeast of your location, bearing 270. Aircraft type is complicated. Just need a runway and emergency services standing by. Walsh grabbed the backup radio, his 23 years of air traffic control experience, telling him this was about to become the kind of night that ended up in incident reports and FAA investigations. Unknown aircraft, we need your registration number and pilot identification. Are you declaring an emergency? The pause that followed lasted exactly 7 seconds. Morrison knew because she counted them, watching the digital clock on her console tick away moments that felt heavier than they should have. When the voice returned, it carried a weight that made both controllers exchange glances. Pilot identification is Sarah Chun. Registration. Let's just say it's not in your system anymore. Morrison's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, ceramic shattering against the floor in a spray of lukewarm liquid and porcelain fragments. The name hit her like a physical blow, dragging up memories she'd tried to bury for 5 years. Sarah Chun, the charter pilot who disappeared over the Pacific in 2019. Taking with her a small plane and 3 passengers who'd never been found, despite weeks of Coast Guard searches. Walsh saw her reaction and took over the radio, his voice steady, despite the questions racing through his mind. Copy that. We're clearing runway 26 right for emergency landing. Fire and rescue are already moving into position. Through the tower's panoramic windows, they could see the emergency vehicles racing across the tarmac, their red and blue lights painting the pre-dawn darkness in urgent colors. The airport was waking up to accommodate an aircraft that shouldn't exist, piloted by a woman who'd been declared dead half a decade ago. Visual contact, Morrison whispered, pointing toward the southeastern sky. There, barely visible against the star-scattered darkness, a set of navigation lights approached the airport. The pattern was wrong though, not the standard red and green configuration required by aviation regulations. These lights had a blue-white quality that seemed to pulse rather than blink, like a heartbeat made visible against the night sky. The aircraft that emerged from the darkness defied easy classification. It had the general shape of a small charter. Plane, similar to the Cessna Citation that Sarah Chun had been flying when she disappeared, but the details were all wrong. The fuselage seemed to shimmer slightly, as if it were made of some material that didn't quite interact with light the way aluminum should. The wings appeared solid enough, but their edges seemed to blur slightly, like looking at something through water. "Jesus," Walsh muttered, his professional composure cracking for the first time in his career. "What the hell is that thing?" The landing was textbook perfect, the kind of approach that flight instructors use as examples of how it should be done. Touchdown was smooth, the aircraft settling onto the runway with barely a whisper of tire contact. It rolled to a stop near the midpoint of the runway, coming to rest with the kind of precision that spoke of exceptional skill and experience. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft within minutes, their lights creating a carnival atmosphere around something that felt anything but celebratory. Fire trucks positioned themselves at strategic angles, foam cannons ready to deploy at the first sign of fuel leak or electrical fire. Paramedics stood ready with stretchers and medical equipment, prepared for anything from smoke inhalation to traumatic injuries. But the aircraft just sat there, engines silent, navigation lights still pulsing with that strange blue-white glow. No movement from the cockpit, no sign of life from within. The emergency responders waited, following protocols that had been written for normal aircraft operated by living pilots. Chief Fire Marshal Tony Rodriguez approached the aircraft cautiously, his gear designed to protect against conventional aviation hazards. What he found when he reached the cockpit window made him radio for backup, his voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that comes from encountering something outside the realm of normal experience. "Tower, we need the FBI Aviation Unit. And whatever investigators handle unusual incidents. We've got a situation here that's beyond standard emergency response." Through the cockpit window, Rodriguez could see the pilot slumped forward against the controls, unconscious or possibly worse. The figure was clearly female, wearing what appeared to be a standard pilot's uniform, but something about the scene felt wrong. The woman's hair was the right length and color for Sarah Chun. Her build matched the physical description from the missing person reports, but there was something else. Something that made Rodriguez's trained eye catalog details that would later become crucial evidence. The tattoo was visible even through the cockpit glass, a distinctive phoenix design that curved around the pilot's left shoulder, partially hidden by her uniform but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Rodriguez had seen that tattoo before, in the missing person files that had circulated through emergency services when Sarah Chun first disappeared. It was one of the identifying marks that had made her case memorable, a piece of body art that family members had described in detail during those desperate early weeks of searching. But Sarah Chun had been declared dead after 18 months of fruitless investigation. Her aircraft had vanished somewhere over the Pacific, taking with it 3 passengers and leaving behind only questions and theories. The official conclusion had been pilot error during severe weather, with the aircraft presumed to have crashed into the ocean and sunk beyond recovery. Now she was sitting in an impossible aircraft on a Denver runway, unconscious but very much alive, displaying ink that matched a dead woman's skin. Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived at the scene 43 minutes after the landing, her emergency medical bag in one hand and a tablet containing Sarah Chun's medical records in the other. As the airport's chief medical officer, she'd been called in to handle what dispatch had described as an unusual medical emergency, involving a pilot who might be suffering from severe disorientation or possible psychotic episode. What she found, when she finally gained access to the cockpit, was a woman who matched Sarah Chun's physical description in every measurable way, but who also presented medical anomalies that challenged everything Vasquez had learned in 15 years of emergency medicine. The pilot's vital signs were stable but unusual. Her heart rate was steady at 62 beats per minute, her blood pressure was within normal ranges, and her breathing was regular and unlabored. but her body temperature registered at 94 degrees Fahrenheit, low enough to indicate mild hypothermia but not severe enough to explain her unconscious state. More disturbing were the details that became apparent during the initial examination. The woman's skin had a slightly translucent quality, as if she were perpetually on the verge of fading away. Her fingernails, normally opaque, seemed to have a faint luminescence that was only visible in direct light. When Vasquez used her penlight to check pupil response, she found that the woman's eyes reflected light in a way that human eyes shouldn't, like an animal's eyes caught in headlights. The tattoo was definitely real, not a temporary application or skillful makeup. The phoenix design was exactly as described in Sarah Chun's missing person file, down to the small scar that interrupted one of the bird's wing feathers. The ink had the settled quality of a tattoo that had been in place for years, with the slight fading and blurring that comes from time and exposure to sunlight. But the skin around the tattoo told a different story. It bore the telltale signs of prolonged exposure to salt water, the kind of damage that comes from extended immersion in ocean conditions. The edges of the phoenix design showed the characteristic puckering and discoloration that marine investigators associated with bodies recovered from deep water after extended periods. Vasquez documented everything with the methodical precision of someone who understood that her observations would become part of an investigation that would challenge conventional understanding of life, death, and the spaces between them. The woman, who might be Sarah Chun, was transported to Denver Presbyterian Hospital under heavy security, accompanied by federal agents who'd been summoned by airport authorities. The aircraft remained on the runway, surrounded by investigators and military personnel who'd been called in to examine something that defied classification under existing protocols. Initial attempts to board the aircraft met with unexpected resistance. The door handles were freezing cold despite the mild October weather, and anyone who touched the aircraft's surface reported a strange tingling sensation that lasted for hours afterward. The interior of the cockpit was even stranger, with instruments that showed readings from navigation systems that didn't exist, and fuel gauges that indicated the aircraft had been flying on empty for approximately 4 hours. The logbook found in the cockpit contained entries that tracked a 5-year journey across airspace that shouldn't have been navigable by any known aircraft. The handwriting was definitely Sarah Chun's, verified by comparison with flight logs from her career as a charter pilot. But the entries described flights to destinations that didn't appear on any aviation chart, through weather conditions that would have been impossible to survive, carrying passengers whose names didn't match any missing person reports. The final entry, dated just hours before the emergency landing, consisted of a single line written in ink that seemed to shimmer slightly under examination. "Coming home. The others are waiting." FBI aviation investigator Marcus Williams arrived at the hospital 6 hours after the landing, carrying a briefcase full of files related to the Sarah Chun disappearance and a head full of questions that he suspected wouldn't have conventional answers. Williams had been investigating aviation mysteries for 12 years, specializing in cases that involved unusual circumstances or unexplained phenomena. The Sarah Chun case had been one of his first major investigations, and it had haunted him ever since. 3 passengers had boarded her charter flight in San Francisco, bound for a small airport in Hawaii. The weather had been marginal but flyable, the aircraft was well maintained, and Chun had been an experienced pilot with an excellent safety record. They'd simply vanished somewhere over the Pacific, leaving behind only questions and the kind of loose ends that kept investigators awake at night. Now, 5 years later, one of those loose ends had apparently returned from the dead, piloting an aircraft that shouldn't exist and displaying physical evidence of prolonged exposure to conditions that should have killed her years ago. The hospital room where Sarah Chun lay unconscious was kept under constant surveillance by agents who'd been instructed to document anything unusual about her condition or behavior. The woman in the bed looked exactly like the photographs in her missing person file, but there were subtle differences that became apparent under close observation. Her breathing created no fogging on the oxygen mask, despite the fact that the hospital room was kept at a standard temperature that should have produced visible condensation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her skin remained cool to the touch even under heated blankets, and her pulse, while steady, seemed to echo slightly, as if her heart was beating in harmony with something else. The tattoo on her shoulder had become more vibrant since her arrival. At the hospital, the phoenix design seeming to glow with an inner light that was barely visible but definitely present. Nurses reported that the tattoo appeared to move slightly when they weren't looking directly at it, the bird's wings seeming to flutter in their peripheral vision. Dr. Vasquez ran every test she could think of, from basic blood work to advanced neurological scans. The results were consistent in their impossibility. The woman's blood showed normal oxygen levels despite breathing patterns that suggested she should have been in respiratory distress. Her brain activity was normal for someone in a deep sleep, but the EEG readings showed unusual patterns that didn't match any known neurological condition. Most disturbing was the MRI scan, which revealed that while the woman's bone structure and organ placement were consistent with a living human being, there were subtle anomalies that suggested something fundamental had changed about her physical composition. Her bones showed signs of prolonged exposure to pressure conditions that would only be found at extreme ocean depths, and her lung tissue displayed adaptations that would be expected in someone who'd spent years breathing something other than normal atmospheric air. The investigation expanded rapidly as more specialists were called in to examine evidence that challenged basic assumptions about life, death, and the nature of reality itself. Marine biologists studied the saltwater damage to her skin, aviation. Engineers analyzed the impossible aircraft, and forensic specialists compared her DNA to samples from Sarah Chen's family members. Every test confirmed what visual inspection suggested. This was definitely Sarah Chen, the charter pilot who had disappeared over the Pacific Ocean 5 years ago. But she was also something else, something that had been changed by her experience, in whatever realm she'd inhabited during her absence from the world of the living. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Margaret Holloway, a cultural anthropologist who specialized in maritime folklore, was brought in to consult on the case after reading about the unusual circumstances in a preliminary report. Holloway had spent decades studying stories of ghostly mariners and phantom vessels, collecting accounts from sailors and fishermen who claimed to have encountered the spirits of those lost at sea. What she found in the Sarah Chen case matched patterns she'd documented in dozens of similar stories, tales of pilots and sailors who'd returned from the dead to complete unfinished business or deliver messages from the realm beyond. The timing was particularly significant, occurring exactly 5 years after her disappearance, which aligned with folklore traditions that described the dead returning at specific intervals. But Sarah Chen wasn't just any ghost story. She was a modern woman with verifiable identity, flying an aircraft that existed in physical reality, carrying evidence of her time in whatever realm she'd inhabited. She represented something unprecedented in the study of unexplained phenomena, a genuine paranormal event that could be documented, analyzed, and possibly understood using scientific methods. The question that haunted everyone involved in the investigation was simple but profound. If Sarah Chen could return from the dead, what did that mean for everything humanity thought it knew about life, death, and the nature of existence itself? The answer, they would soon discover, was more complex and terrifying than any of them had imagined. Sarah Chen's return was not an isolated incident, but part of something larger, something that connected the living and the dead in ways that would challenge every assumption about the boundary between life and death. As she lay unconscious in her hospital bed, The phoenix tattoo on her shoulder continued to glow with that strange inner light, and somewhere in the depths of her transformed consciousness, Sarah Chun was preparing to wake up and tell a story that would change everything anyone thought they knew about what happens when we die. The investigation was about to become something much more than a simple case of mistaken identity or elaborate fraud. It was about to become a journey into the space between life and death, guided by a woman who had crossed that boundary and returned to tell the tale. But first, she had to wake up. And when she did, 3 investigators would learn that some mysteries are too dangerous to solve, and some truths are too profound to ignore. The phoenix was stirring, and with it, secrets that had been buried beneath 5 years of Pacific water, and the kind of darkness that exists between heartbeats, between breaths, between the moment when life ends and whatever comes next begins. Sarah Chun was about to open her eyes, and when she did, the world would never look the same again. Sarah Chun's eyes opened at exactly 11:47 p.m. on the 3rd day, and the first thing she saw was Dr. Elena Vasquez checking her charts at the foot of the hospital bed. The movement was so sudden and unexpected that Vasquez dropped her clipboard, the metal hitting the linoleum floor with a clatter that seemed to echo longer than physics should have allowed. "Hello, Elena," Sarah said, her voice carrying the same crystalline clarity that had confused air traffic controllers 3 days earlier. "You look older than I remember." Vasquez stepped backward, her medical training warring with the impossibility of what she was witnessing. Sarah Chun sat up in bed with fluid grace, as if she'd been resting rather than unconscious for 72 hours. Her skin still had that translucent quality, but now it seemed more deliberate, as if she were choosing to exist somewhere between solid and ethereal. "You know my name," Vasquez managed, reaching for the emergency call button without taking her eyes off her patient. Sarah smiled, and the expression carried warmth that felt entirely human despite everything else about her condition. "I know a lot of things now that I didn't know before." 5 years is a long time to learn new perspectives on existence. The room's temperature dropped several degrees, not the gradual cooling of faulty climate control, but the sudden chill that comes when something fundamental about reality shifts. Vasquez could see her breath misting slightly, and the monitors attached to Sarah began displaying readings that defied medical explanation. "Where have you been?" Vasquez asked, her scientific curiosity overriding her fear. "Your plane crashed. 5 years ago, you were declared dead." Sarah swung her legs over the side of the bed, her movements creating small disturbances in the air that looked like heat waves in reverse. "Dead is a relative term. I was somewhere else, learning things that the living aren't supposed to understand. But I had to come back." She stood, and Vasquez noticed that Sarah's feet didn't quite touch the floor. She hovered perhaps an inch above the surface, supported by something that wasn't visible but was definitely present. The phoenix tattoo on her shoulder pulsed with that strange inner light, and as it did, other markings became visible on her skin. Coordinates etched in flowing script along her forearms, navigation charts tattooed in ink that seemed to move when viewed peripherally. "The others are waiting," Sarah continued, echoing the final entry in her logbook. "My passengers from that flight. They've been trapped in the between space for 5 years, and I'm the only one who can bring them home." Vasquez pressed the emergency call button, but the sound that emerged from the speaker was wrong. Instead of the standard hospital tone, it produced a sound like wind across water, like voices calling from very far away. Sarah heard it too, tilting her head with the expression of someone listening to a conversation in another room. "They're getting restless," she said softly. "The longer they wait, the harder it becomes for them to remember who they were. Eventually, they'll fade entirely, and their families will never know what happened to them." The hospital room door opened, but instead of medical personnel responding to the emergency call, FBI investigator Marcus Williams stepped inside. He'd been monitoring Sarah's condition from a command post set up in the hospital's administrative wing, waiting for exactly this moment. Behind him came Dr. Margaret Holloway, the cultural anthropologist whose research had provided the only framework for understanding what they were dealing with. Williams had his service weapon drawn but pointed at the floor, a compromise between preparation and the recognition that conventional tactics probably wouldn't be effective against someone who'd already died once. Holloway carried a thick folder filled with maritime folklore and accounts of similar phenomena, research that had suddenly become more relevant than she'd ever expected. "Sarah Chun," Williams said, his voice steady despite the surreal circumstances. "I'm Agent Williams, FBI. I investigated your disappearance 5 years ago." Sarah turned toward him, and Williams felt the weight of her attention like a physical force. Her eyes held depths that seemed to extend far beyond the confines of her skull, as if he were looking into spaces that existed outside normal geometry. "I remember you," she said. "You interviewed my sister, asked about my tattoos, and identifying marks. You were thorough, but you were looking for a body. You couldn't find what wasn't there to be found." Williams holstered his weapon, recognizing the futility of threatening someone who existed in a state beyond conventional harm. "Where were you? What happened to your passengers?" The temperature in the room continued to drop, and now all 3 living occupants could see their breath. The monitors attached to Sarah flatlined, not because she was dying, but because whatever she'd become no longer registered on instruments designed to measure human life. "We crashed," Sarah said, beginning to pace the room in that hovering walk. That defied gravity. Severe turbulence over the Pacific, engine failure, loss of all navigation systems. The plane went down in a storm that shouldn't have existed, in waters that were deeper than any charts indicated. She paused by the window, looking out at the Denver skyline as if seeing something else entirely. "But we didn't die, not immediately. We sank for what felt like hours, deeper than should have been possible. The pressure should have killed us, but instead it changed us. We found ourselves in a place between places, where the rules of physics become suggestions and time moves differently." Dr. Holloway stepped forward, her academic excitement overriding her fear. "The maritime folklore speaks of threshold spaces, realms that exist at the boundary between life and death. Sailors called them the deep roads, passages that could only be navigated by those who'd crossed over." Sarah nodded, acknowledging the accuracy of ancient knowledge. "The deep roads, that's exactly what they are. Pathways through this space. Between heartbeats, between thoughts, between the moment consciousness ends and whatever comes after begins. My passengers and I have been traveling those roads for 5 years, trying to find our way back to the world of the living." Williams pulled out his notebook, though he suspected that whatever he wrote would sound like fiction when he tried to explain it later. "Why now? Why come back after 5 years?" "Because the pathways are closing," Sarah said, her voice carrying urgency for the first time. "Whatever force allows the dead to travel the deep roads is weakening. If I don't retrieve my passengers soon, they'll be trapped forever in a realm where memory fades and identity dissolves. They'll become something else, something that was never human." She turned back to face them and the phoenix tattoo on. Her shoulder flared with brilliant light. As it did, the other markings on her skin became clearly visible. Navigation charts that showed impossible geography, coordinates that pointed to locations that existed only in the spaces between reality, tide tables for oceans that had no names. "I need your help," she continued. "The aircraft I flew here can travel the deep roads, but it requires living souls to anchor it to reality. Without that connection, it becomes just another ghost ship, doomed to wander forever between worlds." Vasquez found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "You're asking us to help you retrieve dead people. I'm asking you to help me save 3 souls who've been lost in a realm that exists beyond death, but hasn't quite achieved whatever comes next. They're trapped in a liminal space, conscious but fading, aware but unable to affect change in either world. Williams closed his notebook, recognizing that conventional investigation methods had become irrelevant. What would that involve? What are you asking us to do? Sarah smiled again, and this time the expression carried something that might have been hope. Fly with me. The aircraft can carry living passengers, but it needs their life force to maintain coherence in both worlds. You would be my anchors to reality, the bridge that allows the dead to return to the realm of the living. Dr. Holloway consulted her research, flipping through pages of maritime folklore with growing excitement. The accounts speak of living sailors who volunteered to crew ghost ships, providing the spiritual energy necessary for the dead to complete their final journeys. It's documented in cultures across the globe, from Polynesian navigation myths to Celtic tales of ferry boats that cross between worlds. But those are stories, Williams protested. Folklore and mythology. So was I, until 3 days ago. Sarah pointed out, the line between mythology and reality is thinner than most people realize. I'm living proof that death isn't the ending everyone believes it to be. The room fell silent except for the sound of their breathing and the distant hum of hospital equipment. Outside the window, Denver slept peacefully, unaware that representatives of the living and the dead were negotiating a rescue mission that would challenge every assumption about the nature of existence. Vasquez broke the silence first. If we agree to help, what are the risks? What happens to us if something goes wrong? Sarah's expression grew serious, the weight of 5 years in otherworldly realms evident in her eyes. The deep roads are dangerous for the living. Time moves differently there, and exposure to that realm can change you in ways that aren't easily reversed. You might return with knowledge that you're not equipped to handle, or abilities that don't belong in the world of the living. She gestured to her own transformed state. I can exist in both worlds now, but I'm no longer entirely human. The process of traveling the deep roads leaves marks that go deeper than skin. You would be risking your humanity to save 3 souls who've been lost for 5 years. Williams found himself considering the proposition with the same methodical analysis he'd applied to conventional cases. How do we know your passengers want to be rescued? How do we know they haven't moved on to whatever comes after death? Because I can hear them, Sarah said simply. Every night since I died, I've heard their voices calling across the deep roads. They're still conscious, still aware of who they were and what they've lost. They remember their families, their unfinished business, their hopes and fears. They haven't moved on because they can't move on, not while they're trapped in the between space. The phoenix tattoo pulsed again, and this time the light was bright enough to cast shadows on the hospital room walls. As it flared, the other occupants of the room heard something that made their blood run cold. Voices calling from very far away, desperate and fading, like people shouting across a vast distance in a language they almost but not quite understood. Jennifer Morrison, age 34, flying to Hawaii to reconcile with her estranged daughter, Sarah recited, her voice taking on the cadence of a memorial service. David Chun, no relation, age 47, traveling to attend his father's funeral. Margaret Sinclair, age 61, making what she thought would be her final visit to the place where she'd honeymooned 40 years earlier. She looked at each of them in turn. They trusted me to get them safely to their destination. I failed them once. I won't fail them again. Dr. Holloway closed her research folder, her decision made. I'll go. This is the opportunity of a lifetime to document phenomena that academia has dismissed as impossible. If I don't return, at least my research will provide a framework for understanding what we encountered. Williams struggled with a decision that went against every protocol he'd ever learned. This isn't a federal investigation anymore. This is something else entirely. Some things are more important than protocols, Sarah said gently. Some mysteries are too significant to ignore, even when solving them requires risking everything you think you know about reality. Vasquez surprised herself by nodding agreement. I became a doctor to save lives. If these people are still alive in some sense, still suffering in some way, then I have an obligation to help them. Williams looked at the three women, each representing a different approach to the impossible. A ghost who'd returned from the dead, a scientist willing to risk everything for knowledge, and a doctor committed to healing regardless of the circumstances. He thought about the families who'd never gotten closure, the questions that had haunted his investigation for 5 years, the chance to finally provide answers to mysteries that had defined his career. "When do we leave?" he asked. Sarah's smile lit up the room, literally the phoenix tattoo blazing with joy and anticipation. "Now, the deep roads are easier to navigate during the hours when the living world sleeps. My passengers have been waiting for 5 years. They shouldn't have to wait any longer." She moved toward the hospital room door, her feet still not quite touching the floor. As she walked, her hospital gown transformed into the pilot's uniform she'd been wearing when she landed, the fabric shifting and changing as if it were made of something more responsive than cotton and polyester. "The aircraft is still on the runway at Denver International," she continued. "The living authorities have been trying to understand it using conventional methods, but it responds only to those who've traveled the deep roads. It's been waiting for me to return with the living souls necessary to complete our mission." They followed her through hospital corridors that seemed longer than they had been moments before, past rooms where patients slept unaware that representatives of life and death were walking past their doors. The emergency exit at the end of the corridor opened onto a parking lot that stretched farther than it should have, under stars that seemed brighter and more numerous than the Denver sky typically offered. A vehicle waited for them, though none of them remembered calling for transportation. It looked like a standard airport shuttle, but its interior was larger than its exterior dimensions should have allowed, and the driver's face was hidden in shadows that moved independently of the lighting. The ride to Denver International took place in a silence that felt heavier than the absence of conversation. Each of them was processing the magnitude of what they'd agreed to undertake, the implications of a journey that would take them beyond the boundaries of the known world into realms that existed only in the spaces between life and death. As they approached the airport, Williams noticed that the usual air traffic was absent. No planes taking off or landing, no ground vehicles moving across the tarmac, no lights in the control tower. It was as if the entire facility had been suspended in time, waiting for their arrival. The shuttle stopped beside Sarah's aircraft, which sat exactly where it had landed 3 days earlier. But now, in the pre-dawn darkness, its otherworldly nature was more apparent. The metal seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the navigation lights pulsed with that blue-white glow that seemed to originate from somewhere beyond the visible spectrum. Sarah approached the aircraft with the familiarity of someone returning home after a long journey. She placed her hand on the fuselage, and the metal responded to her touch, becoming more solid and present. The aircraft was real enough for the living to board, but it existed simultaneously in multiple realms. "Before we begin," she said, turning to face her three companions, "you should understand that once we enter the deep roads, we'll be traveling through spaces where the normal rules don't apply. Time may move differently, distance may become meaningless, and you may see things that challenge your understanding of what's possible." She opened the aircraft door, revealing an interior that was both familiar and alien. The passenger cabin looked normal enough, but the windows showed views that couldn't exist from an aircraft sitting on a runway. Ocean depths where impossible creatures moved through currents of light. Skies where multiple moons hung in formations that defied orbital mechanics. Landscapes that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. The deep roads connect all places and times where souls have been lost, Sarah explained as they boarded. "We may see other travelers, other lost souls seeking their way home. Some of them have been traveling for centuries, and they may not remember what they're looking for anymore. Williams took a seat and immediately felt the aircraft respond to his presence. The chair molded itself to his body, and he could sense the vehicle becoming more stable, more connected to the realm of the living. Vasquez and Holloway experienced similar sensations, their life force anchoring the aircraft to reality, while allowing it to exist simultaneously in the otherworldly realm of the deep roads. Sarah took her place in the pilot's seat, and the instruments came alive with readings that displayed navigation information for routes that didn't exist on any chart. Heading indicators showed directions like toward sorrow and past the last memory. Altitude readings measured distance from the living world rather than height above sea level. The journey will take us through spaces where my passengers have been trapped, Sarah said, her hands moving across controls that seemed to respond to intention rather than physical manipulation. Each of them is anchored to a different aspect of the between space, held there by unfinished business or unresolved emotions. We'll need to reach them individually and convince them to return to the realm of the living. The aircraft began to move, not rolling down the runway but lifting directly into the air with a motion that felt more like floating than flying. Denver International Airport fell away beneath them, but instead of the familiar lights of the city, they saw a landscape that existed between dreams and nightmares, where geography was determined by emotion rather than geology. They were entering the deep roads, traveling through spaces that existed in the margins of reality, guided by a woman who died 5 years ago and learned to navigate realms that the living were never meant to see. Behind them, the world of the living continued its normal existence, unaware that a rescue mission was underway in dimensions that existed parallel to but separate from everyday reality. Ahead of them lay the impossible task of retrieving 3 souls from a realm where memory faded and identity dissolved, where the dead wandered endlessly through spaces that connected all the places, where life had ended, but peace had not yet begun. The deep roads stretched out before them, dark and mysterious and filled with the echoes of every soul that had ever been lost between worlds. Sarah Chun was finally going home, and she was taking the living with her into realms that existed beyond the boundary between life and death. The rescue mission had begun, and there was no guarantee that any of them would return unchanged from the spaces between heartbeats, between thoughts, between the moment when consciousness ends. Whatever comes next begins. But 3 souls had been waiting for 5 years in the darkness between worlds, and finally someone was coming to bring them home. The first passenger they found was Jennifer Morrison, suspended in what Sarah called the harbor of regrets, a vast expanse of gray water where abandoned hopes floated like debris from 1,000 shipwrecks. The aircraft descended through layers of mist that felt heavier than atmosphere, each breath carrying the weight of decisions never made and words never spoken. Jennifer hung motionless above the water, her body translucent and flickering like a candle flame in wind. Around her drifted the remnants of every apology she'd never given, every bridge she'd burned in anger, every moment of pride that had cost her something precious. The water below reflected not the sky above but scenes from her life, moments of connection and separation playing out in endless loops across the surface. She's been reliving the fight with her daughter for 5 years, Sarah explained, maneuvering the aircraft closer to the suspended figure. Every harsh word, every slammed door, every phone call that ended in silence. The guilt is what's keeping her here, preventing her from moving forward. Dr. Vasquez pressed her face to the aircraft window, studying Jennifer's condition with medical fascination and growing horror. The woman's form shifted between solid and ethereal, as if she couldn't decide which state of existence to occupy. Her lips moved constantly, forming words that carried no sound, apologies that would never reach their intended target. "How do we reach her?" Williams asked, checking his equipment out of habit before remembering that conventional tools had No relevance in this realm. Sarah brought the aircraft to a hover beside the floating figure, close enough that they could see the tears that had been falling from Jennifer's eyes for 5 years, each drop containing a memory of love squandered or connection severed. We remind her that some mistakes can still be fixed, that some bridges can be rebuilt even after they've been burned. The aircraft door opened, and Sarah stepped out into air that supported her weight, despite the absence of any visible platform. She approached Jennifer with the careful movements of someone approaching a wild animal, her hands extended in a gesture of peace and understanding. "Jennifer," she called softly, her voice carrying clearly through the otherworldly atmosphere. "Your daughter forgives you. She's been waiting for 5 years to tell you that herself." Jennifer's eyes opened, focusing with difficulty on Sarah's face. When she spoke, her voice came from very far away, filtered through layers of regret and self-recrimination. "I said things I can't take back. I destroyed everything good between us." "You were both angry," Sarah replied, moving closer. "You both said things you didn't mean. But love doesn't die because of harsh words, Jennifer. It just gets buried under hurt feelings and wounded pride." Around them, the harbor of regrets began to shift, the gray water becoming more transparent as Jennifer's attention focused on Sarah's words. The floating debris of abandoned hopes started to organize itself into patterns that suggested possibility rather than loss, second chances rather than permanent endings. "She named her daughter after you," Sarah continued, pulling information from sources that existed beyond conventional knowledge. "Jennifer Rebecca Morrison Chun. She's 3 years old now, and she has your eyes and your stubborn streak and your capacity for forgiveness." The revelation hit Jennifer like a physical blow, her ethereal form solidifying as hope flooded through her being. "A granddaughter? A granddaughter who needs to meet her grandmother, who deserves to hear the stories only you can tell about. The woman who raised her mother. Your daughter has been carrying your absence like an open wound for 5 years, Jennifer. She needs you to come home so she can heal." The water below them began to clear, reflecting not scenes of conflict and separation, but moments of connection that had been overshadowed by their dramatic ending. A young woman learning to drive while her mother gripped the dashboard and tried not to scream. Birthday parties where laughter outweighed the inevitable family drama. Quiet moments of understanding that had been forgotten in the heat of their final argument. Jennifer reached toward Sarah, her hand becoming more solid with each inch of movement. "Can I really go back? After all this time, after everything that happened?" "Time moves differently for the living," Sarah assured her, grasping Jennifer's hand and feeling the woman's essence solidify under her touch. "To them, you've been gone for 5 years. To you, it's been an eternity of regret. But forgiveness doesn't have an expiration date, and love doesn't die just because we stop believing in it." Together, they returned to the aircraft to Jennifer's form growing more substantial with each step away from the harbor of regrets. As she took her seat beside Dr. Vasquez, the windows began to show new scenery, the gray waters giving way to landscapes that spoke of different kinds of loss and longing. The second passenger, David Chun, was harder to locate. They found him in what Sarah called the Valley of Missed Farewells, a place where every unfinished goodbye echoed endlessly through canyons carved from crystallized sorrow. David wandered the valley floor, searching for words he'd never had the chance to speak, carrying the weight of a funeral he'd never attended. Unlike Jennifer's static suspension, David was in constant motion, walking endless circles through the valley while arguing with shadows that represented every conversation he'd imagined having with his dying father. The shadows spoke with his father's voice, offering forgiveness that David couldn't accept because he'd never asked for it in person. "He's been rehearsing the same apology for 5 years, Sarah observed as they watched him from above. Every version of the conversation he wished he'd had, every explanation he wanted to give for why he stayed away so long. David's father. had been a traditional man who'd struggled to understand his son's choices, his career, his decision to leave the family business and pursue his own path. Their relationship had been strained for years before the old man's illness, and David had been flying to Hawaii to make peace when the aircraft went down. Guilt is different from men sometimes, Dr. Holloway noted, consulting her research on maritime folklore. In the old stories, male spirits often got trapped by their need to complete tasks they'd left unfinished, to fulfill responsibilities they'd abandoned. Sarah descended the aircraft to the valley floor, approaching David with the same careful patience she'd shown Jennifer. But David was harder to reach, his attention fixed on the shadows that surrounded him, the conversations that played out in endless variations without ever reaching resolution. "David," Sarah called, but he didn't respond, too absorbed in his eternal argument with phantoms that spoke in his father's voice. Williams made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "Let me try. I've spent my career talking to people who've lost family members, who've been carrying guilt about things they didn't do or things they didn't say." He approached David directly, walking through the shadows that parted reluctantly before stepping into the circle of David's endless pacing. "David Chun, my name is Marcus Williams. I investigated your disappearance 5 years ago." David stopped, walking for the first time in 5 years, his attention snapping to Williams with desperate intensity. "You know my family? You spoke to them?" "I did. I interviewed your father before he died, David. He asked about you every day, wondered if you were alive, if you were coming home. He never stopped hoping you'd make it to Hawaii in time." The shadows around them began to shift, their voices becoming less accusatory and more sorrowful. David's father had died while his son was trapped in the deep roads, but his spirit had carried the hope of reconciliation right to the end. "I was too proud," David whispered, his form flickering between solid and ethereal. "Too stubborn, too. Too angry to forgive him for not understanding my choices. I let years go by without talking to him, and then when I finally decided to try, it was too late." Williams drew on years of experience comforting grieving families, applying those skills in a realm where grief took physical form and regret could trap souls for eternity. "It wasn't too late, David. He knew you were trying to reach him. The fact that you were on that plane, flying to see him, that meant everything to him." The crystallized sorrow that formed the valley walls began to soften, the harsh edges of regret transforming into something more manageable. The shadows that had been tormenting David stepped back, their voices changing from accusation to acceptance. "He died knowing that his son loved him," Williams continued. "He died hoping that somewhere, somehow, you were safe and would eventually find your way home. That hope sustained him through his final weeks." David's form solidified as the weight of absolute guilt transformed into the more bearable burden of ordinary human loss. "I never got to say goodbye." "Some goodbyes don't need words," Sarah said, approaching now that David's attention had been freed from his eternal argument with shadows. "Some farewells are written in the choices we make, the distances we're willing to travel, the risks we're willing to take for love." Together, they helped David return to the aircraft, where Jennifer waited with the patient understanding of someone who'd been rescued from her own prison of regret. The valley of mist farewells began to fade behind them as they ascended toward their final destination, the place where Margaret Sinclair had been trapped for 5 years. They found Margaret in the archive of fading memories, a vast library where every forgotten moment from every human life was preserved in books that wrote themselves while slowly dissolving. Margaret sat at a reading table surrounded by volumes that contained her own memories, watching helplessly as the pages turned blank and the stories of her life disappeared into the space between consciousness and oblivion. Unlike the active torment that had trapped Jennifer and David, Margaret's prison was one of passive dissolution. She was losing herself piece by piece, memory by memory, as the archive consumed the stories that defined her identity. Her form, was already more transparent than the others had been, as if she were fading into the background of existence itself. "She's been here the longest," Sarah explained as they approached the reading table where Margaret sat. "The archive is where souls go when they've given up on returning to the living world, when they're ready to let go of everything that made them who they were." Margaret looked up as they approached, her eyes showing the hollow recognition of someone who remembered that she should know these people but couldn't quite recall how or why. "I'm sorry," she said politely, "but I'm afraid I don't remember you. I don't remember much of anything anymore." Dr. Vasquez took the lead this time, her medical training adapted to address a condition that existed beyond physical healing. "Margaret Sinclair, you were flying to Hawaii to visit the place where you honeymooned with your husband 40 years ago." "Husband?" Margaret asked, confusion clouding her translucent features. "I think I might have had a husband once. Or perhaps I only dreamed I did. It's hard to tell the difference anymore." The books around her continued their relentless work, pages turning blank as memories dissolved. A volume labeled First Kiss had only a few pages left. Wedding Day was down to the final chapter. Children's laughter had already gone completely. "Blank, Robert," Vasquez said firmly. "Pull in information from case files and intuition in equal measure. Your husband's name was Robert Sinclair. You met him at a dance in 1963, married him 6 months later, honeymooned in Maui. You had 3 children together." Margaret's form flickered slightly, some small spark of recognition trying to kindle in the growing darkness of her fading consciousness. "Robert, yes, that sounds familiar, but he's gone now, isn't he? They're all gone." "No," Dr. Holloway sighed, stepping forward with the authority of someone who'd spent her career studying the persistence of human connection across time and space. "Robert is alive, Margaret. He's 92 years old, and he's been waiting for you to come home for 5 years. He still wears his wedding ring, still sets 2 places at the dinner table, still talks to your photograph every morning." The dissolution process slowed slightly, some of the blank pages in the surrounding books beginning to show faint traces of returning text. Margaret's memories were trying to reassert themselves against the archive's relentless hunger for forgotten stories. "He remarried," Sarah added gently, providing information that came from her connection to the spaces between worlds. "A lovely woman named Eleanor who understands that some loves transcend death and separation. She helps him remember you, helps him keep your stories alive. But he needs you to come back, Margaret. He needs to know that you made it safely to wherever souls go when they're ready to let go." "I don't understand," Margaret whispered, her hands hovering over books that contained pieces of her dissolving identity. "How can I go back when I can barely remember who I was?" Williams found himself drawing on reserves of compassion he'd developed through years of bringing closure to grieving families. "Because love doesn't require perfect memory, Margaret. Robert doesn't need you to remember every detail of your life together. He just needs to know that you're at peace, that the love you shared was real and lasting and worth the pain of separation." Around them, the archive began to shift, its hunger for forgotten memories balanced against the power of love that refused to be forgotten. The books on Margaret's table stopped dissolving, their pages stabilizing as her identity reasserted itself through the connection she'd maintained with the living world. "I remember the dance," she said suddenly, her form growing more solid. "Our first dance. He was so nervous he stepped on my dress, and I pretended not to notice because he looked so embarrassed." The memory sparked others, pages in the dissolving books beginning to fill in again as Margaret's identity reconstituted itself. Not every detail returned, but enough came back to anchor her consciousness to something recognizable as human experience. "He still plays our song every Sunday morning," Dr. Vasquez added, though she had no way of knowing whether that was true. "Every Sunday for 5 years he's played Moon River and danced with your memory." Margaret stood from the reading table, leaving behind books that had stopped dissolving and begun to preserve her memories rather than consume them. I'd like to see him again. I'd like to tell him that the love we shared made everything else worthwhile. Together, the 4 living souls and 1 ghost pilot guided Margaret away from the archive of fading memories, their combined presence providing the anchor she needed to maintain her identity during the transition back to the realm of the living. The library began to fade behind them as they returned to the aircraft, where Jennifer and David waited with the patient, understanding of fellow travelers who'd been rescued from their own forms of limbo. The journey back to the living world was different from their descent into the deep roads. The aircraft rose through layers of reality that became progressively more familiar, spaces that existed closer to the everyday world where time moved linearly and geography followed conventional rules. The 3 rescued passengers grew more solid with each level of ascent, their forms stabilizing as they approached the boundary between death and life. "There's something you need to understand," Sarah said as they neared the transition point where the deep roads connected to the world of the living. "Coming back from the dead isn't the same as never having died. You'll remember your time in the between space. Remember the lessons you learned there. That knowledge will change you." Jennifer nodded, her hand resting on her chest where she could feel her heart beginning to beat again, slowly and irregularly, but definitely present. "I understand. I'm not the same person who got on that plane 5 years ago." "None of us are," David agreed, studying his hands as they became fully opaque for the first time since the crash. "But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe we needed to lose ourselves for a while to understand what really mattered." Margaret said nothing, but her smile carried the peaceful understanding of someone who'd faced the ultimate dissolution of identity and chosen to return for love rather than let go for peace. She was different too, marked by her journey through realms where memory itself became negotiable. The aircraft broke through the final barrier between worlds, emerging into the pre-dawn sky above Denver International Airport, exactly where they'd departed hours earlier. But time had moved differently in the deep roads, and while their journey had felt like it lasted days, only 3 hours had passed in the living world. They landed on the same runway where Sarah had first appeared 5 years after her death, the aircraft settling onto solid ground with a sense of completion that felt like the end of a very long story. Emergency vehicles surrounded them immediately, but this time their presence felt ceremonial rather than urgent, as if everyone understood that whatever crisis had brought them here was finally resolved. The 3 passengers disembarked slowly, their bodies relearning the weight and substance of physical existence. They were definitely alive, breathing and solid and present, but they carried with them the unmistakable aura of people who'd seen beyond the veil and returned with knowledge that couldn't be easily shared. Dr. Vasquez, Williams, and Dr. Holloway emerged from the aircraft, changed as well, marked by their journey through realms that existed beyond normal human experience. They would spend the rest of their lives trying to process what they'd witnessed, trying to find ways to integrate knowledge that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality. Sarah was the last to leave the aircraft, and as she stepped onto the runway, her form began to change again. The solid presence she'd maintained during the rescue mission started to fade, her connection to the physical world weakening now that her task was complete. "What happens to you now?" Williams asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Sarah smiled, her phoenix tattoo glowing one final time with brilliant light. "I was only borrowed from death for this mission. The deep roads called me back because 3 souls needed rescue, and I was the only one who could navigate the spaces between worlds. Now that they're home, I can finally move on to whatever comes next." She was becoming transparent again, not fading into nothingness, but transforming into something that belonged to a different realm entirely. The boundary between life and death isn't as absolute as people believe. Love transcends that boundary. Responsibility transcends it, and sometimes the need to help others transcends it too. The 3 rescued passengers gathered around her, understanding that this was goodbye in a way that their crash 5 years earlier had never allowed them to achieve. They'd been brought back to the living world, but Sarah's journey was taking her in a different direction. "Thank you," Jennifer said simply, speaking for all of them. "Thank you for trusting me to bring you home," Sarah replied. "Take care of each other. Remember that every day above ground is a gift, and every chance to reconnect with someone you love is a miracle." She began to rise from the runway, not flying but ascending into a realm that existed perpendicular to normal space. The aircraft behind her started to fade as well, its purpose completed and its connection to the physical world no longer necessary. "Will we see you again?" Dr. Holloway called after her, the researcher in her hoping for future opportunities to study phenomena that challenged conventional understanding. Sarah's laughter drifted back to them like music played at the edge of hearing. The deep roads connect all places where souls have been lost. If you ever find yourself lost between worlds, look for the Phoenix. I'll still be flying somewhere out there, helping others find their way home. She disappeared into the sky as the sun rose over Denver, leaving behind 3 living people who'd been dead for 5 years and 4 investigators who'd learned that reality was far more complex and beautiful than they'd ever imagined. The official reports would struggle to explain what had happened, falling back on terms like unusual survival situation and experimental aircraft technology to avoid confronting the implications of what they'd witnessed. But the people who'd been there, who'd traveled the deep roads and seen the spaces between life and death, would carry that knowledge for the rest of their lives. Jennifer Morrison reunited with her daughter and met her granddaughter for the first time, their reconciliation made possible by 5 years of separation that had taught them both the value of forgiveness. David Chun visited his father's grave and had the conversation he'd been rehearsing for 5 years, finding peace in words spoken to stone and silence. Margaret Sinclair returned to Robert, who held her close and never asked where she'd been, understanding that some journeys couldn't be explained in words. The 3 investigators returned to their normal lives, but they were changed by their experience in ways that would take years to fully understand. They'd seen proof that consciousness survived death, that love transcended the boundary between worlds, and that sometimes the most important missions were the ones that couldn't be officially acknowledged. And somewhere in the spaces between heartbeats, between thoughts, between the moment when life ends and whatever comes next begins, Sarah Chun continued her eternal flight through the deep roads. She'd become something new, neither fully alive nor completely dead, but perfectly suited for the task of helping lost souls find their way home. The Phoenix had completed her resurrection, not by returning to life, but by transforming into something that could exist in multiple realms simultaneously. She was the bridge between worlds now, the guide who helped others navigate the impossible distances between death and peace, between loss and acceptance, between the ending of one story and the beginning of whatever came next. Her tattoo had become more than decoration, more than identification, more than memory. It had become a beacon that could be seen from the deep roads, a signal that help was available for those who'd lost their way between worlds. The Phoenix would rise again and again, not from ashes but from love, not from fire but from the endless human capacity to help others find their way home. The weeks following the return from the deep roads passed differently for each person who'd been touched by Sarah Chun's impossible mission. Time itself seemed more fluid for those who'd traveled between worlds, as if their experience in realms where temporal laws were suggestions rather than absolutes had permanently altered their relationship with linear existence. Jennifer Morrison stood in the nursery she'd never expected to see, watching her daughter Rachel change her granddaughter's diaper with the careful precision of a new mother who'd learned to navigate parenthood without the guidance she'd always expected to receive. The room was painted in soft yellows and greens, Colors that spoke of hope and new beginnings, rather than the stark whites and grays that had dominated Jennifer's memories of her time in the harbor of regrets. "She has your stubborn streak," Rachel said without looking up, her voice carrying a warmth that Jennifer remembered from childhood but hadn't heard in years. "Yesterday she refused to sleep unless I was holding her, and when I finally put her down, she woke up every 10 minutes just to make sure I was still there." Jennifer Rebecca Morrison Chun gurgled contentedly on the changing table, her tiny fingers grasping at shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source in the room. Since Jennifer's return from the deep roads, the baby had displayed an unusual awareness of her grandmother's presence, often staring at empty spaces where Jennifer had been standing moments before, as if she could see echoes of movement that existed outside normal perception. "The doctor says she's perfectly healthy," Rachel continued, securing the fresh diaper and lifting her daughter with practiced ease. "But there's something different about her, something I can't quite explain. It's like she's aware of things that babies her age shouldn't notice." Jennifer accepted her granddaughter carefully, marveling at the weight and warmth of new life in her arms. The baby settled against her chest with immediate comfort, tiny fingers curling around Jennifer's thumb with a grip that felt surprisingly strong. As she held the child, Jennifer could feel something pass between them, a connection that transcended the ordinary bonds between grandmother and grandchild. "She's connected to the spaces between worlds," Jennifer said softly, the words coming from knowledge she'd gained during her 5 years in the harbor of regrets. Children born so close to supernatural events sometimes carry traces of that experience. She'd always be able to see things that others miss, understand connections that aren't apparent to normal perception. Rachel sat beside them on the nursery's rocking chair, her expression thoughtful rather than worried. "Is that dangerous? Should I be concerned about her being different?" "Different doesn't mean dangerous," Jennifer assured her, beginning to rock gently as the baby drifted toward sleep. "It means you have insights that others lack, empathy that extends beyond normal human experience. She'll be able to help people in ways that we can't imagine yet." The afternoon light streaming through the nursery windows seemed to bend slightly around the baby, creating patterns that suggested depth and dimension beyond the flat surfaces of walls and furniture. Jennifer recognized the phenomenon from her time in the deep roads, where light behaved according to emotional rather than physical laws. "I named her after you," Rachel said quietly, "but also after someone else. Sarah Chun. I researched the pilot who brought you back, read everything I could find about her disappearance and return. I wanted my daughter to carry the name of someone who'd crossed impossible distances to bring families back together." The baby's breathing settled into the deep rhythm of sleep, but her eyes remained partially open, tracking movements that existed beyond the physical nursery. She was seeing into spaces that connected the living world to the realms Jennifer had experienced during her absence, witnessing the constant flow of souls and stories that moved between different states of existence. "Sarah would be honored," Jennifer said, though she wasn't sure how she knew that. Since returning from the deep roads, she'd maintained a faint connection to the spaces between worlds, allowing her to sense things that existed beyond normal awareness. She's still out there, still helping lost souls find their way home. Your daughter will grow up knowing that love transcends every boundary, even death itself." Rachel leaned against her mother's shoulder, the physical contact bridging 5 years of separation and hurt feelings. "I'm sorry we fought. I'm sorry I said things that pushed you away when you were trying to help. We were both protecting ourselves from pain," Jennifer replied, her understanding deepened by years of contemplating regret in a realm where such emotions took physical form. "But pain shared becomes manageable, and love expressed becomes stronger. We won't make the same mistakes again." The baby stirred slightly in Jennifer's arms, making soft sounds that seemed to echo in spaces beyond the nursery. Other mothers might have been concerned by such unusual behavior, But Jennifer recognized the signs of a child who existed partially in multiple realms. Someone who would grow up understanding connections that others couldn't perceive. Outside the nursery window, Denver continued its normal afternoon rhythm, unaware that 3 people who'd been dead for 5 years were learning to live again in a world that had moved forward without them. The city looked the same as it had before their departure, but their perception of it had been fundamentally altered by their journey through realms where reality followed different rules. David Chun stood in the cemetery where his father had been buried 3 years earlier, holding a conversation he'd been rehearsing for 5 years, but could finally have in the presence of peace rather than regret. The headstone was simple granite, engraved with traditional Chinese characters alongside English text that spoke of a life well lived and a family legacy that would continue through future generations. "I made it to Hawaii eventually," he said to the stone, his voice carrying clearly through the autumn air. "Not in time for your funeral, but in time to understand what you were trying to teach me about family and responsibility and the connections that matter more than career success or personal independence." A gentle breeze moved through the cemetery, stirring leaves that had begun their transformation from green to gold. David interpreted the movement as acknowledgement, his enhanced sensitivity to otherworldly phenomena allowing him to perceive his father's presence in ways that would have been impossible before his time in the Valley of Mist farewells. "The business is doing well," he continued, settling onto the grass beside the grave. "Your partner's son has been running it since you got sick, and he's maintained everything exactly the way you would have wanted. The traditions you established, the relationships you built with suppliers and customers, the reputation for quality and integrity that you spent 40 years developing." Since returning from the deep roads, David had made significant changes to his own career, leaving the corporate consulting firm that had demanded constant travel and accepting a position with the family business that allowed him to honor his father's legacy while building something that could be passed to future generations. The work was different from what he'd been doing, more connected to community and tradition, but it provided satisfactions that his previous career had never offered. "I understand now why you wanted me to work with you," he said, placing a fresh bouquet of chrysanthemums beside the headstone. "It wasn't about limiting my opportunities or keeping me trapped in outdated traditions. It was about connection, about being part of something larger than individual achievement or personal success." The cemetery was nearly empty except for an elderly woman tending flowers at a grave several rows away, her movements careful and deliberate as she arranged fresh blooms with the precision of someone who'd been performing this ritual for many years. David recognized the behavior, understanding that grief took many forms and that healing required different approaches for different people. "I'm seeing someone now," he continued, sharing news that felt important despite the one-sided nature of the conversation. "Her name is Linda, and she works with the Grief Counseling Center downtown. She helps families who've lost people in aviation accidents, helps them navigate the specific challenges that come with sudden loss and unanswered questions." Linda Wong had been assigned to work with the families of the 3 passengers who'd returned from the deep roads, helping them process the complex emotions that came with recovering loved ones who'd been declared dead years earlier. Her work had brought her into contact with David during his readjustment period, and their professional relationship had gradually evolved into something deeper and more personal. "She understands loss in ways that most people don't," David explained. To his father's grave. "She's lost people too, knows what it feels like to carry unfinished conversations and unspoken apologies. But she also understands that healing is possible, that connections can be restored even after they've been severed by death or distance or misunderstanding." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of autumn flowers and the distant sound of traffic from the main road beyond the cemetery's boundaries. David closed his eyes and allowed himself to feel his father's presence more directly, using skills he'd developed during his time in the Valley of Mist. farewells to bridge the gap between the living world and the spaces where consciousness persisted after physical death. "You approve of her," he said, the certainty coming from intuition rather than evidence. "You appreciate that she's dedicated her life to helping others heal from the kind of pain we carried between us for so many years. You're glad that I found someone who understands that love requires courage, that forgiveness requires strength, that building something lasting requires commitment to something beyond immediate satisfaction." A small bird landed on the headstone, perching there with the comfortable familiarity of a creature that had made this cemetery its home. David interpreted its presence as another sign of his father's approval, understanding that the boundary between symbolic and literal meaning had become less important since his return from realms where metaphor and reality were indistinguishable. "I'll be back next week," he promised, beginning to gather his things for the return trip to the city. "Linda wants to meet you in whatever way that's possible. She believes that healing family relationships requires acknowledgement of all the people who've been part of the story, including those who've moved beyond the physical world." As he walked back toward his car, David felt the weight of 5 years of regret lifting from his shoulders like mist dissipating in sunlight. His father's forgiveness had been available all along, waiting for David to stop arguing with shadows and accept the peace that came from understanding that love didn't require perfect communication or flawless timing. Margaret Sinclair sat in the sunroom of the assisted living facility where she and Robert had moved after her return, watching her husband tend the small garden he'd created outside their window. At 94, Robert moved more slowly than he had during their original marriage, but his hands remained steady as he cared for the roses that had been Margaret's favorite flowers during their life together. "He planted those the year I disappeared," Margaret said to Eleanor, the woman who'd become Robert's companion during Margaret's absence and had gracefully accepted her return without jealousy or resentment. "Every morning for 5 years he watered them and pruned them and talked to them about our life together." Eleanor nodded, her understanding deepened by her own experience of loving someone who carried the memory of another love as an integral part of his identity. "He never stopped believing you would come back," she said. "Even when everyone else accepted that you were gone forever, Robert maintained his certainty that your story wasn't finished." The 3 of them had developed an unusual but functional living arrangement, with Eleanor choosing to remain part of Robert's life even after Margaret's return. She'd spent 5 years learning to love a man who spoke constantly about his missing wife, and Margaret's reappearance had confirmed rather than threatened the foundation of that relationship. "You kept him whole during my absence," Margaret sighed, grateful for kindnesses that went beyond conventional understanding. "You helped him remember our love without letting it prevent him from continuing to live. That's a rare kind of generosity." Since returning from the archive of fading memories, Margaret had discovered that her experience of losing and recovering her identity had given her insights into the fluid nature of human connection. She understood that love could exist in multiple forms simultaneously, that relationships could evolve and expand rather than simply replacing what had come before. "We're all part of the same story now," Eleanor replied, pouring tea from a service that had belonged to Margaret's grandmother, but had been cared for by Eleanor during the years of Margaret's absence. "Love doesn't diminish when it's shared among more people. It becomes stronger, more resilient, more capable of surviving the challenges that life brings." Through the window, they could see Robert examining a rosebud that had begun to bloom. Despite the late season, his attention focused with the intensity of someone who'd learned to find meaning in small beauties and everyday miracles. His awareness of his wife's conversation was evident in the occasional glance toward the sunroom, but he respected their need for privacy while they navigated the complex emotions of their unusual situation. "The memories are different now," Margaret continued, referring to her experience in the archive where her identity had been gradually dissolving until love called her back to coherence. "Some details are clearer than they were before I died. while others remain fuzzy or incomplete. But the emotions attached to those memories are stronger, more vivid, as if experiencing loss made me appreciate what I'd had. Eleanor listened, with the careful attention of someone who'd spent years understanding that grief and love were different faces of the same profound human experience. Her work with the Grief Counseling Center had taught her that healing required acknowledging all the complex emotions that arose from loss, including relief, guilt, anger, and the kind of love that transcended rational explanation. Robert speaks differently about your marriage now, she observed. Not with the idealized perfection that sometimes comes from grief, but with honest appreciation for both the joys and challenges you shared. Your absence taught him to value the ordinary moments as much as the special occasions. Margaret smiled, understanding that her husband's growth during their separation had been as significant as her own journey through realms beyond death. He learned to see our relationship as it really was, rather than taking it for granted. I learned to see it as precious, rather than assuming it would always be available. The afternoon light in the sunroom had the golden quality that came with autumn afternoons, when the sun hung lower in the sky and cast everything in tones that suggested both completion and new beginning. Margaret recognized the beauty with enhanced awareness, her time in the archive having taught her to appreciate moments of clarity and connection as gifts rather than expectations. "What happens next?" Eleanor asked, the question carrying genuine curiosity rather than anxiety about their unconventional future. "We continue to learn," Margaret replied, her certainty coming from wisdom gained through experiencing the dissolution and reconstruction of identity. "We continue to love each other in whatever forms that love needs to take. We continue to build something meaningful from the time we have together, however long that might be." Through the window, Robert completed his garden work and turned toward the sunroom with the smile that had sustained Margaret through 5 years in realms where memory itself was negotiable. His love had been strong enough to call her back from dissolution, and now their combined love was strong enough to create space for relationships that challenged conventional definitions but honored the complexity of human emotional experience. "He's ready for his afternoon tea," Eleanor observed, beginning to prepare the tray with movements that spoke of years of shared routine and mutual care. "We're all ready," Margaret agreed, understanding that their unusual family had been forged through experiences that went beyond normal human understanding but had resulted in connections that were deeper and more resilient than conventional relationships often achieved. The three of them would spend the evening as they spent most evenings, sharing stories and memories and plans for whatever future remained available to them. They were living proof that love could survive death, separation, loss of memory, and the kind of fundamental changes that challenged basic assumptions about human identity and connection. Outside their window, Denver continued its normal rhythm, unaware that in one sunroom of one assisted living facility, 3 people were demonstrating that the boundaries between life and death, between past and present, between one form of love and another, were far more flexible than most people realized. The roses Robert had tended during Margaret's absence continued to bloom, their beauty enhanced rather than diminished by the unconventional love that had nourished them through seasons of separation and reunion. They would continue to bloom as long as love continued to flow between the 3 people who'd learned that family could be created from circumstances that defied explanation but honored the fundamental human need for connection, understanding, and acceptance. Dr. Elena Vasquez returned to her medical practice with a transformed understanding of the boundary between life and death, carrying knowledge that couldn't be shared in medical journals but profoundly influenced her approach to treating patients who existed in liminal states between recovery and loss. Her experience in the deep roads had given her insights into consciousness that existed beyond brain function, awareness that persisted despite the absence of conventional vital signs. "The neurological tests show minimal activity," she explained. to the family gathered around the bed of a young man who'd been in a coma for 3 weeks following a motorcycle accident. But I want you to understand that consciousness can exist in forms that our instruments can't measure. Your son may be aware of your presence and your love even if he can't respond in ways that we can document. Since returning from her journey through realms where physical laws were suggestions rather than absolutes, Vasquez had developed an enhanced sensitivity to the presence of consciousness in patients who appeared to be beyond conventional treatment. She could sense when someone was genuinely unconscious versus when they were aware, but unable to communicate through normal channels. "Keep talking to him," she advised the mother, whose vigil beside her son's bed had entered its 4th week. "Tell him stories about his childhood. Play music that he enjoyed. Maintain the connections that define his identity. Love can reach across distances that medicine can't bridge." The family exchanged glances that suggested they'd been hoping for more conventional medical advice, but something in Vasquez's tone convinced them that her recommendations came from sources of knowledge that went beyond standard medical training. They'd been desperate enough to try anything, and her suggestion that their son might be reachable through emotional rather than physical means offered hope where other doctors had provided only statistics about outcomes for similar cases. After the family left, Vasquez remained in the room with her comatose patient, using skills she'd developed during her time in the deep roads to sense the presence of consciousness that existed beyond the reach of conventional medical instruments. The young man's awareness was definitely present, not in his physical brain, but in spaces that connected his individual consciousness to larger patterns of existence. "I know you can hear me," she said softly, pulling a chair close to his bed. "I've been to the places where consciousness exists when physical connection becomes impossible. You're not lost, just temporarily separated from your ability to communicate through your body." The monitors continued their steady recording of vital signs that remained stable but minimal. Brain activity that suggested deep unconsciousness, but didn't account for the subtle signs of awareness that Vasquez had learned to recognize. The young man's presence in the room was stronger than his physical condition should have supported, as if part of his consciousness was operating independently of his damaged brain. "Your family loves you," she continued, maintaining the kind of ongoing communication that families often abandoned after medical professionals suggested that such efforts were pointless. "They're maintaining connections that will help guide you back when you're ready to return. Don't worry about the timeline. Don't struggle against the process. Healing happens at the pace that consciousness requires, not according to medical expectations." Over the following weeks, Vasquez documented subtle changes in the young man's condition that occurred in response to emotional rather than medical interventions. His vital signs strengthened when family members shared positive memories. His brain activity increased during visits from friends who brought laughter and stories from the world he'd left behind. 3 months after her initial consultation with his family, the young man opened his eyes during a session where his sister was reading from a book they'd enjoyed together as children. His first words were coherent and contextually appropriate, suggesting that his consciousness had remained intact despite the absence of conventional brain activity measurable by medical instruments. "I was somewhere else," he told Vasquez during his first lucid conversation following his emergence from the coma. "Not asleep, not unconscious, but in a different space where time moved differently and communication didn't require words. I could hear my family, feel their love, but I couldn't respond until the connection between my consciousness and my body was restored." His recovery challenged conventional medical understanding of consciousness and brain function, but Vasquez documented every aspect of his healing process for future reference. Her experience in the deep roads had taught her that awareness could exist independently of physical brain activity, that consciousness was far more resilient and adaptable than medical science typically acknowledged. "The boundary between life and death is more complex than we realize," she noted in her private research journal, documenting observations that couldn't be published in peer-reviewed medical journals, but might someday contribute to expanded understanding of human consciousness. Patients in liminal states may be accessing forms of awareness that exist beyond conventional measurement, requiring treatment approaches that address emotional and spiritual needs alongside physical healing. Her practice evolved to incorporate insights gained from her journey through realms where consciousness existed independently of physical form, developing treatment protocols that honored the possibility of awareness in patients who appeared to be beyond conventional treatment. Her success rate with comatose and minimally responsive patients improved dramatically, though she couldn't explain her methods in terms that medical colleagues would accept. FBI investigator Marcus Williams returned to his work with a transformed understanding of the cases that had previously been classified as unexplained phenomena, approaching investigations of missing persons and unusual incidents with awareness that conventional explanations might not account for all forms of human experience. His files expanded to include documentation of events that challenged rational explanation but followed patterns that suggested underlying coherence rather than random supernatural occurrence. The aircraft was definitely there, he reported to his supervisor regarding a case involving reports of a vintage World War II bomber that had been sighted flying over rural Colorado despite the fact that no such aircraft should have been operational in the area. Multiple witnesses, radar confirmation, even photographs taken by people who had no reason to fabricate such a story. Since returning from the deep roads, Williams had developed enhanced sensitivity to cases that involved intersection between the world of the living and realms that existed beyond conventional understanding. He could recognize when missing persons cases involved ordinary disappearances versus situations where people had somehow crossed into spaces that existed parallel to normal reality. The pilot filed a flight plan for a destination that doesn't exist on any current aviation chart, he continued, sharing details that would have seemed irrelevant before his experience with Sarah Chun's impossible aircraft. But the coordinates correspond to a military airfield that was closed in 1943 after a training accident that killed 17 personnel. His supervisor listened with the patience of someone who'd learned to trust Williams' investigative instincts, even when his methods defied conventional explanation. Williams had developed a reputation for solving cases that other investigators couldn't crack, though his success rate had improved dramatically since his involvement in the Sarah Chun incident. "Are you suggesting that we're dealing with a ghost plane?" the supervisor asked, not entirely joking. "I'm suggesting that we're dealing with phenomena that don't fit conventional categories," Williams replied, his terminology carefully chosen to avoid language that would undermine his credibility. Within the Bureau, the boundary between explainable and unexplainable events is less absolute than we typically assume. His approach to investigation had evolved to include research into historical records that might provide context for seemingly supernatural events, understanding that many unexplained phenomena had roots in past events that created ongoing connections between different states of existence. The vintage bomber sightings, he discovered, occurred annually on the anniversary of the training accident, suggesting that the deaths of 17 young pilots had created a recurring intersection between past and present. The families of the lost aircrew reported similar sightings for decades after the accident, he noted, presenting documentation that previous investigators had dismissed as grief-induced hallucinations. But the reports are too consistent, too detailed, to be explained by psychological factors alone. Something is maintaining a connection between that historical tragedy and present-day reality. Williams developed protocols for investigating cases that involved apparent supernatural phenomena, creating documentation systems that could record events that challenged conventional explanation while maintaining the professional standards required for federal law enforcement work. His success in resolving previously unsolvable cases earned him recognition as a specialist in unusual circumstances, though he never discussed the source of his enhanced investigative abilities. Dr. Margaret Holloway returned to her academic research with unprecedented access to primary source material about phenomena that had previously existed only in folklore and legend. Using her experience in the deep roads to develop new theoretical frameworks for understanding supernatural events as natural occurrences that operated according to laws that weren't yet fully understood by conventional science. The maritime folklore describes navigation routes that connect different realms of existence. She explained to her graduate students during a seminar on cultural anthropology and unexplained phenomena. What I propose is that these phantom passages represent real geographic features that exist in dimensions that intersect with but remain separate from normal space-time. Her academic work had gained new credibility since her involvement in the Sarah Chun case, though she couldn't discuss the specifics of her experience without undermining her professional reputation. Instead, she focused on developing theoretical models that could accommodate supernatural phenomena within frameworks that academic institutions could accept. The concept of liminal spaces appears in cultures worldwide, she continued, presenting research that drew connections between ancient folklore and modern reports of unexplained phenomena. These threshold realms consistently appear in stories about the dead returning to complete unfinished business, about living people crossing temporarily into otherworldly realms, about places where the normal rules of existence become flexible. Her students listened with the fascination that came from encountering ideas that challenged conventional understanding while remaining grounded in rigorous academic methodology. Holloway had developed a reputation for bringing intellectual rigor to subjects that were often dismissed as superstition or fantasy, creating space within academic discourse for serious consideration of phenomena that didn't fit established scientific categories. What we're seeing in contemporary reports of unexplained events may be documentation of natural phenomena that operate according to principles we don't yet understand, she proposed, offering theoretical frameworks that could accommodate supernatural experiences without requiring abandonment of rational analysis. The consistency of these reports across cultures and historical periods suggests underlying patterns that merit serious investigation. Her research had evolved to focus on developing protocols for documenting and analyzing supernatural phenomena, using academic standards that maintained intellectual credibility, while remaining open to possibilities that challenged conventional explanation. She was building bridges between folklore and science, between ancient wisdom and modern understanding, between the world of rational analysis and the realm of experiences that defied easy categorization. The four investigators who'd traveled the deep roads with Sarah Chun had returned to their normal lives forever changed by their experience in realms that existed beyond conventional understanding. They carried with them knowledge that couldn't be easily shared, but profoundly influenced their approach to their work and their understanding of the complex relationship between life and death, between the world of the living and the spaces where consciousness persisted after physical existence ended. Together, they represented a new category of human experience, people who'd crossed the boundary between life and death and returned with insights that would influence their understanding of reality for the rest of their lives. They were living bridges between worlds, carrying the knowledge that love transcended every boundary and that the connections between souls persisted across distances that couldn't be measured in conventional terms. Their story had become part of the larger narrative of human experience with the supernatural, adding contemporary documentation to folklore traditions that stretched back to the beginning of recorded history. They were proof that the boundary between life and death was more permeable than most people realized, that consciousness could exist in forms that challenged conventional understanding, and that love was a force powerful enough to call souls back from realms where memory itself became negotiable. The phoenix had completed her resurrection by transforming into something that could exist in multiple realms simultaneously, And the people she'd touched during her impossible mission carried that transformation forward into the world of the living, where they would spend the rest of their lives helping others understand that reality was far more complex and beautiful than anyone had ever imagined. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.